April 30th, 1945, Ravensbrück concentration camp, German-occupied Poland. The Soviet Red Army is less than 2 miles from the gates. Inside the camp, approximately 2,000 sick prisoners remain. The male SS guards and officers have already fled toward the west, toward the advancing British and American lines. They have taken the fastest cars, the best routes. They are not interested in heroic last stands. They are interested in reaching a part of Germany they can surrender to, where they might be treated as soldiers rather than war criminals. The female guards, the Aufseherinnen, are still there. Some of them are also preparing to flee. Some are packing their possessions. Some are destroying documents. One of them, a woman named Dorothea Binz, who is 25 years old and has served at this camp since 1939, is on her way out. She is walking through Ravensbrück one last time. She has been deputy chief wardress. She has beaten women with a leather whip. She has trained over 100 other female guards in how to do the same. She has shot prisoners. She has stood at the gate and sent people to the punishment blocks. She is leaving. No one is stopping her. She has a destination planned. She is heading west. Another woman, Johanna Langerfeld, the chief wardress at Ravensbrück, the highest-ranking female guard in the entire Nazi concentration camp system, is also making arrangements. She is older than Binz, she is 45 years old, and she is thinking about what is going to happen to her. Unlike Binz, Langerfeld has an additional layer of complexity. She has shown occasional moments of mercy toward prisoners. She has saved some lives. She has also overseen a system that murdered tens of thousands. She is getting ready to disappear into the German countryside. I am going to warn you right now. The story of what happened to the SS women captured after the fall of the Third Reich is a story about incomplete justice, about the disproportionate focus of post-war prosecution on male perpetrators, about how a small fraction of female war criminals stood trial while the vast majority were released. It is also a story about something far more disturbing, about how some of the most brutal female guards in history were freed to walk back into German society, were given new identities, were allowed to work, to marry, to have children, to live full lives without ever answering in a court of law for what they had done. And it is a story about a single extraordinary case where an SS guard was saved from death not by Nazi networks, but by the very women she had tortured. Make sure you are subscribed, because this story, like all the stories we are telling you here, deserves to be known in its full complexity and weight. This is the story of what happened to the SS women captured after the fall of the Third Reich. Let's start with a number. By the end of the war, approximately 3,700 women were serving as concentration camp guards across the Nazi system. They worked at Ravensbrück, which was the largest and most notorious. They worked at Auschwitz, at Bergen-Belsen, at Stutthof, at Majdanek, and at dozens of other camps. They were not in the SS proper, because the SS was an all-male organization. They were members of what was technically called the female civilian employees of the SS, or the Aufseherinnen. They answered to male commandants, but they had authority over female prisoners. By the end of the war, it was estimated that between 500 and 1,000 of these women had committed documented war crimes. Of those 500 to 1,000 documented female war criminals, how many stood trial? Let's be precise about the number. It is remarkably small. Across all the post-war trials conducted by British, American, French and Polish authorities, approximately 38 female guards were tried for war crimes. 38 out of 500 to 1,000, a conviction rate somewhere between 4 and 8%, and of those 38 who were tried, approximately 20 were executed. The rest received prison sentences ranging from life imprisonment to 5 years. Some were released immediately after trial due to time served in holding camps. The remaining 460 to 960 female guards, most were never prosecuted at all. Many were released from holding camps without facing any trial. Some were interviewed by investigators, found to have committed no documented war crimes in the eyes of Allied prosecutors, and let go. Some disappeared into the chaos of post-war Germany. Some changed their names, some emigrated. Some simply reintegrated into German society as ordinary civilians. This is the statistic that needs to sit with you. Thousands of male guards and officers stood trial. Tens of thousands were held in prisoner of war camps. Thousands were executed. But when it came to female guards, the vast majority were released. The system that was designed to hold people accountable for war crimes applied that accountability extremely selectively when it came to women. Why? That is a more complicated question than it initially appears. One answer is organizational. When the Allies liberated the camps, they prioritized capturing and interrogating male SS officers and male guards. Men held the command positions. Men were the commandants. Men were the doctors. Men were the camp leaders. Female guards, in the initial understanding of Allied investigators, were viewed as subordinates, as following orders from men above them. The logic was that if you prosecuted the men who gave the orders, the female guards would be rendered irrelevant. This logic was not entirely wrong, but it was not entirely right either, because the female guards did not simply follow orders. Many of them acted with independent initiative, with sadism, with agency. But this distinction was lost in the initial rush to apprehend the male leadership. Another answer is something harder to articulate but harder to ignore: gender. Post-war societies were not comfortable with the full reckoning of female criminality in the camps. Female guards challenged the notion that women were naturally nurturing, that women were naturally less capable of brutality. It was easier in some ways to ignore them, to process them through holding camps and release them without trial, to suggest that the real criminals were the men, that the women had been caught up in a system they did not fully understand or control. This was often false. Many female guards understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. A third answer is practical. After the war, Western Europe and North America were engaged in the opening moves of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was the new enemy. Germany was being divided and reintegrated into the Western Alliance. There was a limit to how much time and resources could be spent prosecuting the losers of the last war, when a new conflict was beginning. Female guards were low priority. They were released. They blended back into society. This is the context in which we need to understand the very small number of female guards who were actually tried and executed. They were the exceptions. They were the ones who were captured in the immediate vicinity of camps that were liberated by Western allies. They were the ones whose crimes were so thoroughly documented and so thoroughly witnessed by survivors who were immediately available to testify that they could not be ignored. They are the ones we will discuss. Dorothea Binns was 25 years old on the day Ravensbrück was liberated. She had served there since 1939, when she was a 19-year-old girl looking for stable employment. She had grown up in a village near the camp, the daughter of a domestic servant. She was not wealthy. She was not educated. She was not exceptional in any way except one: she had displayed, from her first days as a guard, an eagerness for violence that set her apart even among the other female guards at Ravensbrück. The nickname the prisoners gave her was the Golden Devil. Blonde hair, blue eyes, young, conventionally attractive face. And inside that face, according to survivor testimony from multiple sources, a coldness that was absolute. Binns never went anywhere without her leather whip. It was not for show. She used it. She used it on women who moved too slowly during roll calls. She used it on women who looked at her. She used it on women who were already starving and weakened to the point of being unable to stand. She continued to strike them after they fell. She had a romantic relationship with an SS officer named Edmund Bruning. They lived together in a house outside the camp. According to prisoner testimony, they enjoyed watching women being flogged. They would sit together and watch, speaking to each other in low voices, as if it was an evening's entertainment. as if the bleeding woman on the ground was a performance staged for their benefit. This was not duty. This was not the carrying out of camp orders. This was something else. By 1943, Binz had been promoted to Stellvertretende Oberaufseherin, Deputy Chief Wardress. She had authority over more than 100 other female guards. She trained them. She set the standard. She showed them what was expected. In the language of post-war investigators, she was a force multiplier. She did not just commit her own crimes. She created conditions and trained personnel that would commit crimes on a larger scale. In April 1945, as the Soviets approached Ravensbrück, Binz fled. She made her way west toward the British lines. On May 3, 1945, British troops captured her in Hamburg. She was remanded to a holding camp at Recklinghausen, a former sub-camp of Buchenwald. She was given a prisoner number 5. She would spend the next 20 months in custody. In December 1946, the first Ravensbrück trial began in Hamburg at a building called the Curio House. It was a British military court. 16 defendants stood trial on charges of murder and brutality. Among them were medical staff, administrative personnel, male SS officers, and 7 female guards. Dorothea Binz was prisoner number 5. The trial lasted 2 months. Survivor after survivor took the stand. They described in precise detail what Binz had done. They described the whip. They described her laughing while prisoners were being beaten. They described her selecting women for punishment details that were known to be fatal. They described her arbitrary violence, violence that appeared to have no purpose except the gratification of inflicting it. Binz's defense was straightforward. She admitted to using physical punishment, but argued that she had never intended to kill anyone. She argued that no one had actually died as a result of her direct actions. She was young, she was honest about her guilt, and she had simply been carrying out the orders of her superiors. It did not work. On February 3, 1947, Dorothea Binz was found guilty on all counts. The tribunal sentenced her to death by hanging. She was 26 years old. According to one German news magazine, Der Spiegel, when Binz learned that her appeal had been denied and that the death sentence would be carried out, she attempted suicide by cutting her wrists. The attempt failed. She survived and would be hanged. On May 2, 1947, at Hameln prison in Germany, British executioner Albert Pierrepoint hanged Dorothea Binz. She was 26 years old. She had served at Ravensbrück for 6 years. She had beaten prisoners for 6 years. She had trained other guards to beat prisoners for 6 years. It had taken exactly 2 years from her capture to her execution. 2 years from April 1945 to May 1947. 2 years for the legal system to assemble evidence, hold a trial, render a verdict, hear an appeal, and carry out a sentence. By the standards of post-war European justice, it was remarkably swift. Now let's talk about Johanna Langerfeld, because her story is very different, and it is in many ways more troubling. Johanna Langerfeld was born on March 5, 1900. She was the daughter of a domestic servant. She was not educated beyond basic schooling. She trained as a domestic economy instructor and worked in various domestic and institutional jobs. In 1935, at age 35, she applied for a position as a guard at a German working institution for so-called antisocial women. From 1938 onward, she began to work at concentration camps. In May 1939, she became the chief female guard at Ravensbrück when the camp opened. She was the first chief guard. She established the rules, set the culture, trained the guards. She remained in that position until 1943. Langerfeld was not as obviously sadistic as Binz. Survivors did not describe her as someone who enjoyed inflicting violence for its own sake. But she was not humane either. She oversaw a system that killed tens of thousands. She made selections. She imposed punishments. She maintained order through terror. She did everything a chief guard needed to do to maintain her position and her authority. In 1942, she was transferred to Auschwitz to run the women's camp there. She lasted 6 months. She was dismissed from that position under circumstances that have been disputed by historians. Some accounts say she showed excessive sympathy for Polish prisoners and was removed because of it. Some accounts say she was simply not getting along with the male commandant. Some accounts say she was emotionally unstable and unsuited for the work. The truth appears to be that she was dismissed for reasons having to do with personality conflicts and administrative disputes, rather than for crimes or abuses. She returned to Ravensbrück and remained there until the camp was liberated. When the Soviets approached in April 1945, Langenfeld did not flee as dramatically as Binz. She was captured by Soviet forces, but she was not executed. She was handed over to British custody. In December 1945, she was arrested by the United States Army. In September 1946, she was extradited to Polish authorities, who wanted to prosecute her for crimes at Auschwitz. She was held at Montlupic prison in Krakow, awaiting trial. She knew she would be tried. She knew the likely outcome. She knew that the Soviet trials had been following a pattern. Conviction, death sentence, execution. She would have seen or heard about the trials of other camp staff. She would have known what was coming. On December 23, 1946, 1 month after being handed over to Polish custody, Johanna Langenfeld escaped from Montlupic prison. The circumstances of the escape are extraordinary. She did not escape through some Nazi network. There were no old SS contacts waiting to smuggle her out. There was no elaborate plan involving money or forged documents or an underground railroad of former Nazis. Instead, according to the research of journalists and historians who investigated the case decades later, Johanna Langenfeld was helped by her former victims, Polish women who had been imprisoned at Ravensbrück, Polish women who had survived the camp, Polish women who had every reason to want her dead. These survivors, according to contemporary accounts and later testimony, organized Langenfeld's escape. They provided information about guard rotations. They may have provided money or documents. They hid her after she escaped. They sheltered her in a convent. They helped her move through Poland and eventually back into Germany. And they kept the secret. They did not reveal her escape to authorities for years. When the secret finally came out, it threatened punishment for both Langenfeld and the survivors who had helped her. Why did they do it? That is the question historians and filmmakers have wrestled with ever since. There are several explanations that have been offered. One is that Langenfeld had shown occasional moments of mercy or restraint at Ravensbrück. She had allegedly intervened in some cases to prevent death sentences. She had, by some accounts, halted the execution of disabled women when she learned of the order. She had shown something that might have been recognized as humanity, or at least as the capacity for humanity. In a system designed to strip away humanity, even small gestures could stand out. Even moments of restraint could be magnified in the memory of prisoners who had experienced absolute cruelty. Another explanation is more complicated. Some of the survivors who helped Langenfeld may have felt a debt toward her. They may have felt that by helping her escape, they were reclaiming some agency, some power. They had been powerless in the camp, they had been victims. Now, by choosing to help someone who would have been executed, they were exercising a choice that the Nazi system had denied them. They were asserting their humanity against the system that had tried to erase it. A third explanation, offered by some historians, is that the survivors simply did not believe that Langenfeld deserved to die. They distinguished between her conduct at Ravensbrück and her conduct at Auschwitz. They knew what she had done at Auschwitz was criminal, but they also believed that whatever she had done at Ravensbrück had been, on balance, less severe than what other guards had done. They believed in the possibility of rehabilitation. They believed in mercy. Whatever the motivation, Johanna Langenfeld was smuggled out of Poland. She hid in a convent. She worked under an assumed name. She lived quietly. By 1957, approximately 11 years after her escape from Polish custody, she returned illegally to Germany. She lived in Munich with her sister. She lived a quiet life. She lived without trial. She lived without conviction. She lived without a sentence. In 1957, she tracked down Margarete Buber-Neumann, a German communist who had been imprisoned at Ravensbrück and had served as Langefeld's personal assistant. Buber-Neumann was living in Frankfurt. Langefeld went to her home. They met. Langefeld told her that she wanted to apologize. She wanted Buber-Neumann to know that she regretted what she had done. She wanted forgiveness. Buber-Neumann did not refuse to see her. She did not turn her in to the authorities. She listened to Langefeld's apology. The details of that meeting are not fully known. But we know that it happened. We know that Langefeld survived the war, escaped justice in Poland, and spent her remaining years living in West Germany. We know that she died on January 26, 1974, at the age of 73, having never been tried for her crimes at Auschwitz or Ravensbrück. Now we need to talk about the full picture, because the stories of Binz and Langefeld are not representative. They are exceptions. The vast majority of female guards were handled differently. Between 500 and 1,000 female guards had documented war crimes. Of those, 38 were tried. Of the 38, approximately 20 were executed. The rest received prison sentences or were released. Of the 460 to 960 who were never tried, the vast majority were simply released. They were held in camps like Recklinghausen for periods ranging from months to years. They were investigated. No charges were brought. They were released into German society. This is what happened to them. They got on with their lives. They remarried. They had children. They worked. They retired. They lived ordinary, peaceful lives. Some changed their names. Some disappeared into small towns in southern Germany where no one knew who they were or what they had done. Some died without anyone ever learning about their war crimes. Some never faced a moment of public accountability. The disparity between male and female perpetrators is striking. Thousands of male camp guards were tried. Thousands were executed. But when the Allies liberated the camps and began the work of prosecution, female guards were not the priority. Male guards held the official positions of authority. Male guards were the immediate targets. Female guards were secondary. And when you are secondary in a system that is only prosecuting a tiny fraction of perpetrators anyway, you are very likely to be left out entirely. Several British trials focused specifically on concentration camp staff from camps in the British zone. The Ravensbrück trials consisted of 7 separate trials held between December 1946 and July 1948. But even in these focused trials of specific camps, female guards made up only a minority of defendants. And among the trials in other jurisdictions, female guards were even rarer. The Nuremberg trials, the most prominent and publicized of all the post-war trials, focused on the leadership. Female guards were not tried there. Polish trials, Soviet trials, French trials, American trials, all of them had far more male defendants than female defendants. The Stuttgart trial of 1946 tried 15 people for crimes at that camp. 5 of them were women. All 5 women were sentenced to death. Wanda Klaff at her trial reportedly told the court that she was very intelligent and very devoted to her work, and that she had struck at least 2 prisoners every day. She said this with apparent pride. She was hanged. Gerda Steinhoff was hanged. Iwa Paradis was hanged. Jenny Wanda Bachmann was hanged. Elizabeth Becker was hanged. But the vast majority of female guards at Stutthof were never tried. They were released. The Auschwitz trial in Krakow in 1947 tried 40 former staff members. Among them were Maria Mandl and Therese Brandl, whose executions we already discussed. But 40 people on trial out of how many thousands who had worked at Auschwitz? The vast majority of guards, male and female, were never prosecuted. This is important because the trials, as they happened, created a distorted picture of accountability. They focused on the leadership, on the commandants, on the senior officers. They focused on the people whose crimes were most thoroughly documented and most thoroughly witnessed by survivors who were available to testify. They did not capture the full reality of perpetration. They did not hold accountable the vast majority of people who had chosen to participate in the system. They created an appearance of justice, while the reality was that most perpetrators, male and female, simply escaped any legal consequence. Now let's talk about another element of this story that is uncomfortable but important. The possibility that post-war societies were partly motivated in their leniency toward female guards by the fact that they were women. Female perpetration challenged cultural narratives about women and evil. It was easier, in the post-war period, to see women as victims, as followers, as peripheral to the real system of crimes. It was harder to acknowledge that women had been active participants in genocide, that women had beaten other women to death, that women had stood at selections, that women had participated in the machinery of mass murder with the same agency and intent as men. This does not mean that female guards were deliberately spared as a gesture of gallantry. It means that the system of post-war justice, like the broader post-war culture, had difficulty processing the reality of female criminality. So the system processes fewer females, prosecutes fewer females, executes fewer females. The appearance is that justice has been done. The reality is that most perpetrators, regardless of gender, escaped justice entirely. Some female guards who were released from custody eventually emigrated. Some went to the United States. Some went to South America. Some went to Australia. They changed their names. They lived new lives. They had families. Some of them were never discovered. Some were tracked down decades later by journalists or historians. Some were arrested in the 1970s or 1980s, or even later, decades after the war, by German authorities conducting belated investigations. But by then they had lived entire adult lives as free people. They had experienced things that their victims never got to experience. They had seen their grandchildren born. They had retired peacefully. The law had caught up with them, but only after they had already received years or decades of freedom that should never have been granted. There is one more female guard we need to talk about. Because her story represents something different, the fact that being prosecuted was not a guarantee of execution. Hertha Ehlert was a German woman who worked as a guard at Ravensbrück, at Majdanek, at Auschwitz, and at Bergen-Belsen. She was married. She had been called up for service as a guard in 1939. She worked in the camp system for the duration of the war. She was captured. She was tried. She was convicted. But instead of being sentenced to death, she was sentenced to life imprisonment. She was held in prison in Recklinghausen. She served her time. In 1954, she was released on parole. She lived until 1997. She lived until old age. She died of natural causes in peaceful retirement, having served approximately 8 years out of a life sentence. Ehlert is one of several female guards whose sentences were commuted or who were released early due to post-war decisions about lenient treatment. She committed documented war crimes at multiple camps. She was convicted. She was imprisoned. She was released. And then, she was free. Another female guard, Hertha Bofer, who worked at Ravensbrück, at Stutthof, at Auschwitz, and at Bergen-Belsen, received a 10-year prison sentence. She was released in the mid-1950s. In 1999, she gave an interview to historians in which she was asked if she regretted her service in the camps. According to the record of that interview, she did not express remorse. She said she had simply been doing her job. She talked about her work as though it was an ordinary occupation. These women, who had beaten prisoners, who had watched prisoners being shot, who had participated in selections, who had overseen systems designed to kill, received prison sentences measured in years. and were released to live normal lives. They were not executed. They were not imprisoned for life. They were released. Now we need to talk about the larger numbers and what they mean. By the most conservative estimates, approximately 3,700 female guards worked in the Nazi concentration camp system during the war. More than half of them simply disappeared at the end of the war. They were not captured. They were not detained. They were not investigated. They simply went home. Some changed their names and reintegrated into German society. Some emigrated. Some died without anyone ever knowing what they had done. Of the roughly 1,500 to 2,000 who were captured, the vast majority were interviewed and released without trial. They were held in camps like Recklinghausen for varying periods. They were asked questions about their service. They were determined to have committed no prosecutable war crimes, or their crimes were deemed not serious enough to pursue. They were released. Of the 500 to 1,000 who had clear documentation of war crimes, approximately 38 were tried. That is 4 to 8%. Of those 38, approximately 20 were executed. Approximately 18 received prison sentences ranging from life imprisonment to just a few years. Most of those who received prison sentences were released on parole or early release within a decade of their conviction. So the numbers look like this: approximately 3,700 female guards, approximately 0 to 0 prosecuted for crimes, approximately 20 executed out of 3,700. That is a 0.5% execution rate. Approximately 38 tried out of 3,700. That is roughly a 1% prosecution rate. For male guards, the numbers are different. Exact figures vary depending on which sources you consult, but estimates suggest that approximately 10,000 to 20,000 male guard and administrative personnel worked in the camp system. Thousands were tried, thousands were convicted, thousands were executed. The prosecution rate for men was dramatically higher than the prosecution rate for women. The execution rate for men was dramatically higher than the execution rate for women. Why? The answers we've already explored apply. Male guards held the official positions of authority. Male guards were the priority. Male guards were the initial focus of post-war investigations. But there is also a gendered element to the disparity that is harder to articulate, but harder to ignore. Female perpetration challenged narratives. It was easier to tell a story about evil men perpetrating atrocities than it was to tell a story about ordinary women participating in atrocities. The first story fit existing frameworks about gender and evil. The second story broke those frameworks. As a result, female perpetrators were prosecuted less, convicted less, executed less. They escaped justice more often than their male counterparts. And having escaped justice through the formal legal system, many of them lived normal lives. They were not hunted by Nazi underground networks. They did not spend their lives in hiding. They simply blended back into society and lived. Dorothea Binz was exceptional because she was tried and executed. Johanna Langerfeld was even more exceptional because she was helped to escape by her former victims. The vast majority of female guards were unremarkable. They were simply released. They were investigated and found to have done nothing that the post-war system deemed worth prosecuting. They went home. They remarried. They had children. They died peacefully. This is what incomplete justice looks like when it is administered on a massive scale, when millions of perpetrators have committed atrocities, when the resources for prosecution are limited, when the political will for sustained accountability is weak, when the victims are in some cases dead and therefore unavailable to testify. You get mass release of perpetrators. You get a system that catches some people and lets others go. You get female guards disproportionately benefiting from that system because of gender-based assumptions about their guilt and their agency. The trials that did happen mattered. They created a record. They put crimes on the official record of what happened. They provided a platform for survivors to testify. They showed that some people faced consequences. But they are also not what the narrative often makes them seem to be. They are not a complete accounting. They are not a reckoning with the full scope of perpetration. They are a partial accounting that left the vast majority of perpetrators to live out their lives unprosecuted. On May 2, 1947, Dorothea Binns was hanged. She was 26 years old. She had spent 2 years from capture to execution. She died for the crime she had committed at Ravensbrück. She was one of the 20 female guards out of approximately 3,700 who received the death sentence. Her death mattered. Her execution created a record. Her trial provided testimony that survivors could give about what had happened in the camp. But her execution was an outlier. It was not representative of what happened to most female guards. On December 23, 1946, 1 month after being handed to Polish custody, Johanna Langefeld escaped from prison with the help of her former victims and lived another 28 years. She was never tried. She was never convicted. She was never punished by any legal system. She lived until 1974. She had served at 2 of the largest camps in the Nazi system. She had overseen the training of hundreds of female guards. She had made selections. She had maintained a system that murdered tens of thousands. And she never stood trial for it. She was protected by the very women whose deaths she had overseen. Bertha Ellert was sentenced to life imprisonment and released after 8 years. She lived until 1997. She spent her retirement in peaceful obscurity. She had worked at 4 different camps. She had participated in the system at multiple locations. She was convicted. But her conviction did not mean she spent her life in prison. She was released. She lived an ordinary life. Herta Both was sentenced to 10 years and released in the mid-1950s. She lived until at least 1999, giving interviews to historians about her wartime service. She described her work as something she had simply done, as though it had been an ordinary job, no different from working in any other capacity. She lived 40 years after her release. Most of her life lived as a free woman, having served less than half her sentence. Let's talk about some of the other female guards who were tried and what happened to them, because the full picture is important. At the first Ravensbrück trial, Elizabeth Marshall, a head nurse who had participated in selections, was found guilty and hanged on May 2, 1947. Greta Bursell, an Officerin who had worked in the women's camp and who had a reputation for cruelty, was found guilty and hanged on the same day. But several other female guards at the same trial received prison sentences. Carmen Maury, a prisoner functionary who had served the SS while also abusing other prisoners, was sentenced to death but committed suicide before her execution could be carried out. Vera Salviquart was sentenced to death and hanged in June 1947. Of the 7 female guards on trial at the first Ravensbrück trial, 5 were convicted. Of the 5 convicted, 4 were sentenced to death. But these were the trials that happened. Thousands of other female guards were never tried. At the Stutthof trial in 1946, 5 women were tried for crimes at that camp. All 5 were convicted. All 5 were hanged. Jenny Wanda Bachmann, Elisabeth Becker, Wanda Klaff, Iwa Paradis, and Gerda Steinhoff. 5 women, all executed. But they were a fraction of the female staff at Stutthof. The vast majority of female guards at that camp were never prosecuted. At the Auschwitz trial in Krakow in 1947, Maria Mandel and Therese Brandl were the only female guards sentenced to death. Both were executed on January 24, 1948. But Auschwitz had employed hundreds of female guards. Dozens were tried. Most received prison sentences. Most were released. The 2 who were executed had the most thoroughly documented and most thoroughly witnessed crimes. But they were also exceptional in that they were tried at all. The Majdanek trials included several trials of female guards. At one trial, Elsa Erich was the first and only woman to face a death sentence. Between 1975 and 1981, Alice Orlowski, Hermine Braunsteiner, Hildegard Leschert, and Hermine Butcher-Buchner appeared in court for crimes at Majdanek. Some received prison sentences, some were acquitted. Most had escaped custody for decades before being brought to trial. Hermine Braunsteiner, one of the most notorious female guards, worked at Ravensbrück and Majdanek. She was captured after the war but was released and actually emigrated to the United States. She lived there until 1976, when she was finally identified and deported back to Germany to stand trial. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. She had lived 30 years as a free woman in America. 30 years. Then she was prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned. But by then, she had had a full adult life. She had married. She had had family. She had experienced all the things that her victims never got to experience. The vast majority of the roughly 3,700 female guards were never captured, never tried, never punished. They lived normal lives. Some became teachers. Some became nurses. Some worked in offices. Some raised families. Some lived to old age and died of natural causes, never having faced any accountability for what they had done. Some were never even identified as having worked in the camps. They simply blended into post-war German society and disappeared. This is the full picture. This is what accountability looked like when applied to female perpetrators at a mass atrocity. This is how the system of post-war justice handled the women who had participated in genocide. The vast majority were never prosecuted. Of those who were prosecuted, some were executed. Some received prison sentences that often meant they were released within a few years. Some had their sentences commuted. Some escaped before trial. Some escaped after trial. And all of this happened in a context where most perpetrators, regardless of gender, simply never faced any trial at all, because the scale of perpetration exceeded the capacity of any justice system to process it. This is not a story about justice. It is a story about incomplete justice. It is a story about how much easier it was to prosecute some people than others. It is a story about how gender shaped who was held accountable and who was not. It is a story about how most perpetrators of atrocities on that scale will simply never be held accountable, because the volume of perpetration exceeds the capacity of any justice system to process it, and because the political will for sustained accountability weakens over time. The rope caught Dorothea Binns. The law caught Hertha Ehlert but released her after 8 years. The law caught Hermine Braunsteiner, but only after she had lived 30 years as a free woman in America. The survivors of Ravensbrück caught Johanna Langefeld and set her free. The vast majority of the others simply disappeared into German society and were never caught at all. They lived. They married. They raised children. They retired. They died of old age. They died without ever standing in a courtroom. They died without ever being held accountable by any legal system or any higher authority for what they had done. That is what happened to the SS women after the fall of the Third Reich. That is how the post-war system handled the women who had participated in the greatest atrocity in human history. Most were freed. A handful were tried. A smaller handful were executed. And an even smaller handful were saved by the very people they had tortured. The memorial at Ravensbrück, the walls where thousands of women were shot, the records of selections, the testimonies of survivors, all of these remain. But most of the perpetrators who worked there never faced justice. They lived their lives. And that failure is something we all inherit.